This video series is going to delve into the consequences of probability blindness. I'm going to demonstrate that what is considered to be the risk-free asset is anything but. I'm also going to use market valuations and interest rates to demonstrate just how confident everyone is that there is no possibility of a ruinous event. The concepts that I'm going to go over are very important, and they are part of the lens through which I view my financial world. The first part of the series is going to be somewhat controversial, but also very instructive for understanding two parallel money systems. Most people are familiar with the game of Russian Roulette. It's an absolutely hideous concept, but it can be reframed to instruct us how to think about systems that can include the inevitable total loss. The concept is fairly straightforward. One or more bullets are placed into the cylinder of a revolver. The cylinder is spun. The player places the revolver against his or her head, and then pulls the trigger. If one bullet is placed in a 6-chamber revolver, then there is a 5 in 6 chance that the player will survive the first pull of the trigger, and a 1 in 6 chance that the player will fatally shoot himself or herself in the head. If the game continues another round without spinning the chamber, the odds are now worse, as there is now a 1 in 5 chance that the player will be shot. Eventually, with enough pulls of the trigger, the outcome of a possible death becomes one of certain death. Why would anyone want to play such a game? There are a few known motives. One of them is inspiring fear by forcing someone else to play. Another is gambling, where wagers are won and lost. There are other motives as well. Some might play to impress upon others their lack of fear. All of these motives are present in the famous Russian roulette scenes from the movie The Deer Hunter, featuring Robert De Niro and Christopher Walken. In the first Russian roulette scene, both De Niro and Walken are forced to play a game for the entertainment of their Viet Cong captors during the Vietnam War. The Viet Cong soldiers were greatly entertained and gambled, while Walken and De Niro's characters were terrified. At the end of the movie, there is a second Russian roulette scene where Walken's character is shown as a hardened character who plays the game professionally and then takes his bullet right in front of De Niro's character. Now, as horrible as this game is, there are theoretical considerations that are instructive to ponder. If you'll stick with me for a few minutes, you'll see where I'm going with this. In real life, only the most deranged individuals would pull the trigger voluntarily. But let's change the game a little bit to see what it can teach us about incentives. Let's replace the outcome of death with the outcome of losing everything of value. So when a person is unlucky enough to get the bullet, they lose their wealth rather than losing their life. Let's also provide a reward for the participant so that in the event that they don't get the bullet, they actually increase their net worth. We can call this incentive anything you like, but I'm going to call it interest. Except for the very short-term duration of the game, namely 6 trigger pulls, this somewhat mimics the game of putting currency on loan in a fiat currency system. It also mimics investing in a single company. We know that ultimately the game ends in tragedy, but there are conditions where playing the game makes some sense, at least over a finite period of time. Let's make the rate of interest high so that a person doubles their wealth every time they pull the trigger and don't get the bullet. What are the possible outcomes for each round of this game? Here is the table of possible outcomes after a certain number of trigger pulls. Suppose our player starts the game with 100 units of wealth. I'm being very arbitrary about what constitutes a unit of wealth, and I'm doing that deliberately. At the end of round 1, the person has an 83.33% chance of still being alive or in the game. This is because there is only a 1 in 6 chance of getting the bullet the first round. After getting past the first round, the player will have doubled their wealth. It is now 200 units. Making it to the end of both rounds 1 and 2 is considerably less likely, but the odds are still 66.67%. If our player makes it, their wealth is now 400 units. Making it through 3 rounds only has a 50% probability, but if the player makes it through these 3 rounds intact, their wealth will now be 800 units from having only wagered 100 units in the beginning. Now notice that the odds continue to get worse and worse the longer the game goes on, until there is a 0% chance of making it through 6 rounds. So, if our player had to commit to playing a certain number of rounds before beginning this game, how many rounds should he or she commit to? The mathematically correct answer can be found by multiplying the odds of still being alive at the end of each round by the wealth that the player would have if still alive. Now, this is the expected wealth. It's a bit of an abstract concept for most people who are not well versed in probability and statistics. Simply stated, it is the average of all possible outcomes weighted by the probability of each outcome. As can be seen, the expected wealth climbs very quickly in the beginning. There is a 50% chance of making it through 3 rounds, but if on the winning side of the game, the player will have quadrupled his or her wealth. For a game of chance where only money is on the line, these are pretty good odds. Notice, though, that there is no incremental benefit of going forward if the player is able to get through 4 rounds unscathed. Even though the wealth, if still alive, goes from 1,600 units to 3,200 units, the probability of making it through round 5 is so small that the expected value of the wealth is pretty low. So in this game, it looks like it would make sense for our player to commit to 3 rounds, and maybe 4 rounds, but not 5, and certainly not 6. Now, as abstract as this game may appear on the surface, there is a very important lesson here for everyone. No matter how great the payoff of each round of play, any game with a potential risk of total loss is not worth playing forever. This is true if the game requires the player to be all in. That is, has to stake everything, as is the case with Russian Roulette. Now, is this always the case in such a game? Yes. Let me illustrate with another game where the risk of complete ruin is much lower. Let's suppose that we have a very large cylinder in the revolver. It has 100 chambers instead of 6. Let's also suppose that because there is a much lower risk of ruin, the player is willing to play for a much lower payoff. So let's give the player a 2% increase in wealth for every round that he or she survives. What does this game look like if the player decides to play long term? Without boring you with all the mathematical details, here's what the game looks like. The player starts with 100 units of wealth and lets it ride. The blue curve shows how much wealth he or she will have after a certain number of rounds, assuming that they don't catch the bullet. Now, it looks like the familiar exponential curve promised to us whenever someone talks about the miracle of compounding, doesn't it? But don't forget, the blue curve is only what the player will have if he or she survives. As time passes, the probability of surviving goes down. The red curve shows a probability-adjusted wealth curve, where the payoff, if still alive, is multiplied by the probability of still being alive. Notice it doesn't increase nearly as quickly as the blue curve does. In fact, it hits a maximum at 50 years and then starts to decline. Eventually, there is a guarantee of total loss. Now, if forced before the game begins to make a choice of how long to play, the player would be wise not to commit to more than 50 rounds. Mathematically, this is the precise answer, but perhaps not the best answer from a psychological or practical standpoint. The probability-adjusted wealth only climbs to 134.58. This is a total actual probability-adjusted return of 34 to 35%. And this is nowhere near the 269.16 units of wealth that the blue curve would suggest that the player might have after surviving 50 rounds. So what lessons does this abstract mental exercise hold for us? There are several. The first lesson is that whenever there is even a possibility of total loss, or even a devastating loss, continuing to play the game with all of your resources will eventually lead to ruin. The second lesson is that whenever there is a possibility of ruin, one should discount the apparent rate of return to take the possible adverse outcome into account. Oftentimes, the possibility of ruin will make what would otherwise appear to be an attractive rate of return look more like folly. The third lesson is that it is always prudent to play these games with a limited percentage of your wealth. And when you do, you should always take profits and either move them to a form of wealth that has no possibility of total loss, or to spend them. Now, is this really such an abstract scenario? Consider that McKinsey found that the average lifespan of companies listed in the Standard & Poor's 500 index in 1958 was 61 years. The pace of innovation today would probably make their lifespan today lower. So if you are investing all of your wealth into a single stock, you should be prepared for ruin. Only by diversifying and taking profits off the table can you reap the benefits of corporate ownership. Now, several sources have indicated that the average lifespan of a fiat currency is 27 years. I don't know if this is the right answer or not, or the right number, or how to go about adjusting the expected life of a currency for its quality. For example, the dollar versus the Venezuelan bolivar. Right? But what I do know is that there is a graveyard full of defunct currencies that is more heavily populated than the list of fiat currencies that are still in use today. Now, with that in mind, it does not make much sense to keep 100% of a person's wealth in cash and bonds, which is what today we are told is the conservative thing to do. The finite but small risk of currency failure in a given year means that over a very long term, there is a near certain guarantee of ruin. I think the central banks are just trying to make sure that the ruin happens a little at a time rather than all at once. So, how do we turn this game on its head and use the consequences of probability theory to our advantage? Stay tuned. In the next part of this series, I'm going to extend our discussion to include the properties of lottery tickets to show you what they can teach us about asset allocation. I'll then discuss the John Kelly betting criteria, which can teach us a lot about asset allocation and what the current market valuations and interest rates tell us about the general consensus of the probability of a ruinous event. I think once we reach the end of this series, you'll find that your time has been well spent. So stay tuned.